July 7, 1944. The sun had barely crested the horizon over the vast Pacific Ocean when Chief Petty Officer Thomas Jenkins stepped into the sweltering galley of the USS Iowa. Steam billowed around his face as he surveyed the organized chaos before him. 20 men worked in synchronized precision, their white uniforms already damp with sweat. Massive cauldrons bubbled with oatmeal, while griddles sizzled with hundreds of eggs. The air was thick with the aroma of fresh bread baking in industrial ovens. "Breakfast in 30 minutes for first shift," Jenkins called out, his voice carrying over the clatter of metal utensils and the hum of the ship's ventilation system. He glanced at his pocket watch, 4:30 in the morning, and took a deep breath. By the end of this day, his team would produce more than 10,000 individual meals to feed the 2,800 sailors aboard America's mightiest battleship. Not one man would go hungry, not even as Japanese aircraft circled overhead and the 16-inch guns thundered across the waves. Jenkins wiped his brow with a cloth, feeling the gentle roll of the ship beneath his feet. The food stores were running lower than he would have liked after 62 days at sea. Fresh fruits were becoming scarce, and they'd nearly depleted their stock of real eggs. Soon they'd have to switch to powdered, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, like every day since they'd left San Francisco, his galley crew would perform their own quiet miracle, turning 7 tons of raw ingredients into enough calories to fuel the men who operated one of the most powerful warships ever built. What he didn't know yet was that in less than 12 hours, Admiral Halsey would order an unexpected course change, cutting them off from their scheduled resupply. The Iowa's culinary crew would face their greatest challenge yet, with enough food to last 3 days, but tasked with stretching it to 7. No one in the 21st Carrier Task Force knew that one chief's defiance of standard rationing protocols that day would become the difference between combat readiness and a ship full of hungry, weakened sailors in the middle of the war's most critical naval campaign. Thomas Jenkins hadn't planned on becoming a Navy cook. Born in 1913 in the small farming community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he was the third son of a corn farmer and his schoolteacher wife. The Jenkins family lived modestly but never wanted for food. Thomas's mother kept a large vegetable garden, and his father traded grain for meat with neighboring farms. The Great Depression hit when Thomas was 16, and while many in his community struggled, the self-sufficient nature of farm life insulated his family from the worst effects. "We always had food on the table," Jenkins would later recall in his memoir, "Feeding the Fleet." When you grow up knowing how to make something from nothing, you never truly go hungry. By 1932, as drought compounded the economic collapse around him, 19-year-old Thomas realized his father's small farm couldn't support all 3 sons. With few prospects in Cedar Rapids and unwilling to burden his parents, he enlisted in the United States Navy. His initial aptitude tests showed mechanical promise, but when recruiters learned of his experience helping his mother preserve and prepare food for large harvest crews, they steered him toward the commissary branch. "I argued against it," Jenkins would write years later. "I wanted to work with engines, with weapons, something that felt like fighting. My father pulled me aside before I shipped out and told me something I never forgot. He said, 'Son, armies win battles on full stomachs. You'll be doing more for the war effort than you know.'" Jenkins's early Navy career took him through culinary school in San Diego, where he showed exceptional organizational talent and an uncanny ability to scale recipes. While other culinary trainees struggled with the mathematics of converting measurements for large-scale cooking, Jenkins could calculate ingredient proportions for hundreds of servings in his head. His instructors noted his leadership abilities as well. Jenkins had a natural talent for coordinating multiple people in high-pressure situations. By 1941, Jenkins had risen to Petty Officer Second Class aboard the destroyer USS Walk. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, the Walk was patrolling near San Francisco. In the frantic military expansion that followed America's entry into World War II, experienced sailors were quickly promoted. Jenkins received a transfer to the brand-new battleship Iowa as she was being fitted out in 1942, advancing to Chief Petty Officer and head of the battleship's massive food service operation. The assignment represented a staggering leap in responsibility. On the Walker, Jenkins had helped manage meals for a crew of under 200. The Iowa, with her complement of nearly 2,800 officers and men, required feeding operations on an industrial scale. What's more, as America's newest and most powerful battleship, the lead vessel of her class, Iowa was expected to maintain exceptionally high standards in all departments, including food service. When I first saw the galley, I nearly turned around and walked out, Jenkins later wrote. 4 massive kitchen spaces, bakery facilities that could supply a small town, refrigeration units larger than my father's entire farmhouse. I wondered what I had gotten myself into. But then I remembered something my culinary instructor had said. Cooking for 2,000 is no different than cooking for 20. You just need bigger pots. The galley crew that Jenkins inherited was a mix of experienced culinary ratings and untested new recruits. His second-in-command was Petty Officer First Class Robert Martinez, a former restaurant chef from New Orleans whose family had run a successful Creole establishment before the Depression. The bakery chief was Frank Olowski, a third-generation baker from Chicago whose specialty was producing bread that remained fresh for days longer than standard Navy recipes. We had 20 men when we started, Jenkins noted in his official reports. Not nearly enough for the task. I immediately requisitioned 10 more, then another 15 as we prepared for deployment. By the time we set sail in 1943, I had a crew of 50, still undermanned by my estimation, but we made it work. During the Iowa's shakedown cruise in the Chesapeake Bay, Jenkins and his crew established the patterns and protocols that would serve them throughout the war. 4 meals would be served daily: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and mid-rats, midnight rations, for those on night watch. The logistics were staggering. Each meal period required serving 700 men simultaneously in shifts, with barely an hour between seatings to clean and reset. Jenkins's methodical approach soon earned him respect throughout the ship. Within months of the Iowa's commissioning, sailors were remarking that the food aboard was noticeably better than on other vessels. Word spread through the fleet, and when sailors transferred to Iowa, many came with stories they'd heard about the quality of meals aboard. "We'll eat like kings," one young ensign reportedly told his parents before deployment. The ultimate test came in October 1943, when Iowa was selected for a special mission, transporting President Franklin D. Roosevelt across the Atlantic to the Allied conferences in Cairo and Tehran. The presidential party would be aboard for weeks, and the eyes of the entire Navy leadership would be on Jenkins's galley crew. It was an immense honor and pressure for the young chief from Iowa. Captain John McCrea summoned Jenkins to his quarters 2 weeks before the president's arrival. "The president has specific dietary requirements," the captain informed him, "and he expects to host dinners with his staff every evening. The admiral will provide details. This is not just about feeding the crew anymore, Chief. This is about representing the United States Navy to our Commander-in-Chief." Jenkins nodded, his mind already calculating the additional supplies and staffing he would need. "We'll make it happen, sir. The president won't have any complaints about the food on Iowa." When Roosevelt came aboard on November 14, 1943, Jenkins's team rose to the occasion. Despite the additional burden of preparing special meals for the president and his staff, regular crew meals continued without interruption. Roosevelt himself commented favorably on the food, and when he addressed the crew before departing, he called Iowa a happy ship, high praise that Jenkins knew reflected in part on his department's contributions to morale. No one yet realized that these experiences, feeding the president, maintaining morale through food during long deployments, and Jenkins's innovative management of limited resources were preparing him and his team for the decisive challenge that would come in the summer of 1944 in the distant waters of the Pacific. As the Iowa prepared to join the war against Japan, Jenkins couldn't know that his greatest test still lay ahead. But as his father had wisely observed years earlier, wars are indeed won on full stomachs, and the outcome of one critical week in the Pacific would soon prove just how true those words were. In early 1944, as Iowa prepared to join the Pacific Fleet, the reality of naval warfare in that theater presented new challenges for Jenkins and his culinary team. The vast distances between friendly ports meant longer periods at sea without resupply. The tropical climate accelerated food spoilage, and the intensity of combat operations meant sailors needed more calories than ever before. The ship transited the Panama Canal on January 7, 1944. As they moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Jenkins called his senior staff together in the chief's mess. "Everything changes now," he told them, spreading a map across the table. "In the Atlantic, we were never more than a few days from friendly ports. Here," he gestured to the vast, empty spaces of the Pacific Ocean, "we could be weeks from resupply. We need to rethink everything about how we store, preserve, and prepare food." Among the logistical challenges Jenkins faced was the sheer volume of provisions required to feed Iowa's crew. Each day the galley team prepared 10,000 individual meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and mid-rats, using approximately 7 tons of food. The massive ship carried enough stores for 119 days at sea, including 1.5 tons of fresh food, 2 tons of frozen provisions, and 3.5 tons of dry goods daily. Statistics from the supply officer's reports illustrated the scale. Each week, Iowa's crew consumed approximately 2,400 pounds of potatoes, 1,900 pounds of coffee, 3,800 pounds of meat, and 9,600 eggs. The bakery produced 800 loaves of fresh bread daily. The milk dispensers poured 250 gallons every 24 hours. Perhaps most challenging was the complex dance of inventory management. Fresh fruits and vegetables would last only so long, even in the ship's refrigerated compartments. Jenkins developed a system of inventory cycling, using the most perishable items first, gradually transitioning to longer-lasting fresh foods, then frozen, and finally canned or dried provisions as a deployment progressed. Lieutenant William Hooper, the ship's supply officer, initially questioned Jenkins's approach. Standard Navy protocol called for maintaining balanced provisions throughout a deployment, Hooper noted in his official reports. Chief Jenkins insisted on front-loading fresh produce consumption, which appeared to violate regulation. However, his system proved effective in reducing waste and maximizing the nutritional value of our stores. I authorized the deviation from standard practice. This decision would later prove crucial during the critical week in July 1944. But first, Iowa and her crew would face the realities of combat in the Pacific Theater. From January through June 1944, Iowa participated in a series of operations supporting the island-hopping campaign. As flagship of Battleship Division 7, she screened aircraft carriers, bombarded enemy positions, and served as a floating fortress of American naval power. During this period, maintaining consistent food service became increasingly difficult, as combat operations frequently interrupted the normal rhythm of ship life. General quarters could be called at any time, recalled Seaman James Williamson, a loader on one of Iowa's 16-inch gun turrets. Sometimes we'd be halfway through a meal when the alarm sounded, and we'd all have to run to battle stations. Hours later, we'd come back starving, and somehow Jenkins's guys always had hot food waiting, no matter what time it was. This adaptability reflected Jenkins's emphasis on preparation and redundancy. He had organized his galley crew into self-sufficient teams, each capable of operating independently if needed. If one part of the massive galley was damaged or inaccessible during battle, other sections could compensate. He also maintained a constant supply of battle rations, sandwiches, coffee, and high-energy foods that could be quickly distributed during extended combat operations. The beauty of Jenkins's system, noted Martinez, his executive chef, was that it bent without breaking. Navy regulations specified exactly how galleys should operate, down to the serving times and menu rotations. But Thomas understood that in combat, flexibility saved lives. By June 1944, as the Allied forces prepared for the decisive Marianas Campaign, Iowa had established a reputation throughout the fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, reportedly commented after a visit, "I've never seen a happier crew, and in my experience, when sailors eat well, they fight well." What no one anticipated was how soon that observation would be tested. As Iowa joined Task Force 58 for the assault on Saipan, Jenkins received troubling news from Lieutenant Hooper. Due to logistical constraints and the accelerated operational timeline, their next scheduled resupply had been postponed. The supply ships that would normally rendezvous with the fleet had been diverted to support the invasion forces. Jenkins reviewed his inventory with growing concern. They had provisions for perhaps 15 days at current consumption rates, but the new operational plans indicated they might need to remain on station for 3 weeks or more. "We'll need to implement rationing measures," Hooper informed him. "Standard protocol calls for an immediate 20% reduction in portions, with further reductions as needed." Jenkins nodded, but remained silent, his mind already racing ahead to calculate alternatives. That evening, he returned to his small office adjacent to the main galley and worked through the night, filling notebooks with calculations and alternative menu plans. What he developed violated multiple Navy regulations on food service. Instead of implementing across-the-board rationing, he created a tiered system that maintained full portions for men engaged in physically demanding roles, gun crews, engineering personnel, damage control teams, while modestly reducing allocations for those in less strenuous positions. He reconfigured recipes to maximize calories while minimizing ingredient use, and developed a controversial plan to borrow surplus provisions from other departments' emergency stores. When he presented his plan to Hooper the next morning, the supply officer initially refused to authorize it. "This violates at least 6 different regulations," Hooper pointed out. "If anyone up the chain of command reviews our logs, we'll both face disciplinary action." "With respect, sir," Jenkins replied, "we're not sailing a regulation book. We're sailing a battleship with 2,800 men who need to remain combat effective. If following the rules means hungry sailors when the Japanese attack, then perhaps the rules need bending." After several hours of debate, Hooper reluctantly approved Jenkins's plan, with one condition. All decisions and deviations would be documented, with Jenkins taking full responsibility. Both men knew that if the approach failed, Jenkins's naval career would likely end in court-martial. Neither man could have known that within days the largest carrier battle in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, would erupt around them, testing not only Iowa's fighting capabilities, but the innovative food management system that Jenkins had just put in place. June 19, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness over the Philippine Sea was interrupted by the rhythmic flashing of anti-aircraft fire as Task Force 58 engaged attacking Japanese aircraft. Iowa's massive guns thundered in defense of the American carriers, the concussion rattling dishes and equipment throughout the galley spaces deep within the ship. Below decks, Thomas Jenkins and his culinary team worked with grim determination. Battle stations had been called 3 hours earlier, and they knew that once the combat intensity decreased, hundreds of exhausted sailors would need hot food and coffee. Standard protocol during general quarters limited galley operations to essential functions only, but Jenkins had quietly prepared his spaces to resume full production the moment permission was granted. "Sir, engineering is requesting additional rations for the boiler crews," reported culinary specialist second class Miguel Rodriguez, one of Jenkins's runners who maintained communication between the galley and various ship departments during battle. "They've been at emergency power for 4 hours now, and the men are fading." Jenkins nodded. "Take 30 of the high-protein sandwiches and 2 gallons of sweetened coffee. Use the aft passageways to avoid the medical teams." He made a notation in his log tracking the additional distributions against his carefully calculated stores. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, soon to be nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the lopsided American victory, would rage for 2 days. Throughout the engagement, Iowa's guns provided critical anti-aircraft coverage for the vulnerable aircraft carriers. The constant combat operations meant irregular mealtimes, increased caloric requirements, and immense stress on the ship's food service capabilities. By the battle's end, the strategic victory was clear. American forces had devastated the Japanese carrier fleet, destroying hundreds of aircraft and sinking 3 carriers. But the extended combat operations had taken a toll on Iowa's provisions. 7 days into what was supposed to be a 15-day deployment, they had consumed nearly 60% of their available food stores. At this rate, we'll be on emergency rations before we reach our resupply point, Lieutenant Hooper informed Captain Alan McCann, who had recently taken command of Iowa. Chief Jenkins has implemented conservation measures, but the combat operations have accelerated consumption beyond our projections. Captain McCann studied the inventory reports. What does Jenkins recommend? He's proposed some unorthodox solutions, Hooper replied carefully. They involve significant deviations from standard rationing protocols. Will his approach keep my crew fed and fighting ready? He believes so, sir. But I should note that his methods don't align with Navy regulations for food service during shortage conditions. McCann was silent for a moment, weighing the bureaucratic risks against the operational necessities. Finally, he handed the reports back to Hooper. Tell Jenkins he has my authorization to implement whatever measures he deems necessary. The paperwork is your problem, Lieutenant. Just keep my sailors fed. With this unprecedented authority, Jenkins expanded his innovative approach. He reorganized the ship's entire meal schedule, consolidating from 4 daily meal periods to 3, but increasing the caloric density of each meal. He implemented what he called strategic ingredient management, reserving high-energy foods for periods of intense operational activity and using more filling, less critical ingredients during quieter watches. Perhaps most controversially, he began repurposing ingredients from non-essential uses. Fruits normally reserved for officers' wardroom desserts were redirected to provide vitamin C for the entire crew. Coffee normally allocated to flag officer ceremonies was redistributed to night watch stations. Sugar typically used for baking was converted to high-energy drink supplements for damage control teams. Every decision came down to a simple calculation, Jenkins later explained. Which use of this ingredient provides the greatest combat effectiveness per ounce? That was our only metric. Tradition, hierarchy, comfort, all secondary to maintaining the fighting strength of this ship. Not everyone appreciated his approach. The executive officer formally complained about the reduction in quality of officers' meals. A tradition as old as naval warfare itself dictated that officers received preferential provisions. Jenkins responded by personally delivering a comprehensive breakdown of caloric distribution across the ship, demonstrating that his system actually ensured more equitable nutrition across all ranks than traditional Navy protocols. The modern battleship is a machine that requires every component functioning at peak efficiency, he argued. A well-fed gun captain is more valuable to our combat effectiveness than a well-garnished officer's dessert. As Iowa continued operations through the last days of June and into early July, the situation grew increasingly dire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had forced significant changes to the fleet's operational timeline. What's more, intelligence reports indicated Japanese submarine activity along their planned resupply route, forcing Admiral Halsey to order yet another course change that would further delay their rendezvous with supply ships. On July 5th, as food stores dwindled to critical levels, the ultimate test of Jenkins's system arrived in the form of new orders. Iowa was to proceed immediately to provide bombardment support for the invasion of Guam. The operation would add at least 5 days to their deployment before resupply would be possible. Lieutenant Hooper delivered the news personally to Jenkins in the main galley storage area, where the chief was conducting his twice-daily inventory. We have enough for 3 days at minimum rationing levels, Hooper said quietly. Maybe 4 if we implement emergency protocols, but not 7. Not even close. Jenkins surveyed the nearly empty storage racks, the depleted freeze boxes, the dwindling stacks of preserved goods. For the first time since taking command of Iowa's food service, he felt a wave of genuine doubt. The math was unforgiving. There simply wasn't enough food to sustain the crew for the extended deployment, no matter how creatively he distributed it. Standard Navy procedure was clear. When provisions reached emergency levels, the ship was to implement strict rationing immediately, prioritize combat personnel, and request emergency resupply, even if it meant compromising operational security or mission objectives. But as Jenkins stared at his inventory sheets, a radical alternative began to form in his mind. It would require ignoring decades of Navy supply doctrine, violating direct regulations about food storage, and risking his entire career on an unproven theory from his childhood on an Iowa farm. "Sir," he said finally to Hooper, "I need to speak with the captain immediately. I believe there's a solution, but it will require his direct authorization." The meeting in Captain McCann's quarters that evening would change Naval Food Service procedures for the remainder of World War II, though official recognition would be decades in coming. Present were Jenkins, Hooper, the Executive Officer Commander James Holloway, and the ship's senior medical officer, Lieutenant Commander Douglas Martin. Jenkins laid out his proposal without preamble. "I believe we can stretch our remaining provisions to 7 days or more without implementing emergency rationing, but it will require immediate action and significant deviations from standard protocol." His plan was both simple and revolutionary. Rather than preserving foods according to Navy specifications, which prioritized long-term storage stability over nutritional preservation, Jenkins proposed implementing farm preservation techniques he had learned as a child. These methods would dramatically accelerate food preparation, but potentially preserve more nutrients and create more filling meals from the same ingredients. The Navy designed its food storage and preparation protocols for predictability and standardization, Jenkins explained, but they sacrifice efficiency for consistency. "With the captain's permission, I want to implement a system that prioritizes caloric delivery over everything else." Commander Holloway objected immediately. "These regulations exist for a reason, Chief. Food safety, predictable supply management, standardized nutrition? You're suggesting we throw all that away on untested folk methods?" Jenkins remained calm. "Sir, these methods aren't untested. They've fed America's farmers through winters and hard times for generations. They're simply untested at naval scale." The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Commander Martin, studied Jenkins' proposal. From a medical perspective, the nutritional theory is sound. If, and it's a significant if, these methods work as described, they would actually increase the bioavailability of nutrients compared to standard Navy preparations. Captain McCann was silent throughout most of the exchange, but his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. Finally, he raised a hand to quiet the debate. "Chief Jenkins, let me understand exactly what you're proposing. You want to completely reorganize our food preparation to implement farming techniques in order to stretch our supplies beyond what Navy protocols suggest is possible." "Yes, sir." "And if you're wrong?" Jenkins met his gaze steadily. "If I'm wrong, we'll deplete our supplies faster than projected and be forced to implement emergency rationing anyway. I'll accept full responsibility and any consequences." "And if you're right?" "If I'm right, sir, Iowa maintains full combat effectiveness through the Guam operation without our crew knowing how close we came to running out of food." The captain considered this for a long moment. Then he turned to the medical officer. "Doctor, if Chief Jenkins implements these methods, will there be any risk to the crew's health?" Martin hesitated. "Based on the scientific principles involved, no. It's unconventional, but not unsafe." McCann nodded once. "Very well. Chief Jenkins, you have 72 hours to prove your approach works. If at that point our supply situation hasn't improved according to your projections, we revert to standard protocols immediately. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As Jenkins turned to leave, McCann added, "And Chief, I don't need to tell you what happens if this fails." Jenkins nodded grimly. They both knew that failure meant not just professional consequences for him, but potentially compromised combat effectiveness for Iowa during critical operations. That night, Jenkins gathered his entire galley crew. "Everything changes tomorrow," he told them. "What I'm about to ask you to do violates multiple sections of the commissary manual. Anyone who objects can transfer to standard duties elsewhere in the ship, no questions asked." Not a single man stepped back. Over the next 3 days, Iowa's galleys underwent a transformation unlike anything in naval history. Jenkins implemented what he called total ingredient utilization, cooking methods that used every part of their remaining provisions, including components normally discarded. Vegetable trimmings became the base for nutrient-rich broths. Meat bones were roasted and then simmered for 24 hours to extract maximum protein and fat. Bread that would normally have been discarded after a day was repurposed into filling breakfast puddings fortified with precious remaining eggs and milk. Perhaps most dramatically, Jenkins reconfigured the ship's massive steam kettles, normally used only for specific cooking applications, to create a continuous cooking system that maximized flavor extraction while minimizing fuel use. The technique, adapted from his mother's practice of keeping a perpetual soup pot going during harsh Iowa winters, allowed a single pot of stew to evolve over days, with new ingredients added as others were consumed. "We're treating the entire ship as a single farmhouse kitchen," Jenkins explained to his bewildered but increasingly impressed staff. "Nothing goes to waste. Everything serves multiple purposes. The goal isn't 3 separate meals a day, it's continuous nourishment for a working community." By the 3rd day, the results were undeniable. Food waste had dropped by nearly 80%. Caloric delivery per serving had increased by almost 30%. Most importantly, sailors reported feeling more satisfied after meals despite portions that appeared no larger than before. Lieutenant Commander Martin conducted spot health checks throughout the crew and found no decrease in energy levels or combat readiness. If anything, some indicators were improving, particularly among sailors who had previously reported digestive issues with standard Navy fare. On July 10th, as Iowa's massive guns bombarded Japanese positions on Guam, Lieutenant Hooper brought the updated provision calculations to Captain McCann. Against all conventional Navy wisdom, Jenkins's methods had stretched their critically low supplies. They would reach their resupply rendezvous before running out of food, without having implemented emergency rationing. "It defies explanation," Hooper admitted. "By every standard calculation, we should be on half rations by now." Captain McCann studied the inventory charts. "Sometimes experience trumps theory, Lieutenant. Jenkins grew up keeping food on the table during the Depression and drought years. That kind of knowledge doesn't make it into naval manuals." When Iowa finally rendezvoused with the fleet supply ship USS Aldebaran on July 14th, her crew remained unaware of how close they had come to severe food shortages. The battleship had maintained full combat operations throughout the Guam campaign, her sailors well-fed and at peak effectiveness, despite being 7 days beyond their projected supply limits. As fresh provisions came aboard, Jenkins supervised the restocking with the same methodical attention he had given to stretching their dwindling supplies. When the transfer was complete, Captain McCann summoned him to his quarters. "Chief Jenkins," the captain began formally, "I've reviewed Lieutenant Hooper's final report on our supply situation during the extended deployment. According to every standard Navy calculation, we should have run out of food 3 days ago." Jenkins stood at attention, uncertain whether praise or reprimand would follow. "Your methods," McCann continued, "while unconventional, maintained this ship's combat effectiveness during a critical operation. I'm placing a commendation in your service record." "Thank you, sir." "However," McCann added, his expression turning serious, "Lieutenant Hooper informs me that documenting your exact methods would reveal numerous violations of standing naval regulations regarding food service." Jenkins swallowed hard but remained silent. A faint smile crossed the captain's face. Fortunately, combat conditions sometimes necessitate incomplete documentation. Your official report will state only that innovative conservation measures were implemented successfully. The details will remain between us. It was as close as the Navy of 1944 could come to officially endorsing Jenkins's revolutionary approach. The bureaucracy wasn't ready to acknowledge that a farm boy from Iowa had improved upon decades of naval logistics doctrine, but across the Pacific Fleet, word spread quietly among supply officers and galley chiefs. The Iowa method became underground knowledge passed between ships, never officially recognized, but increasingly implemented when vessels faced extended deployments or supply challenges. Thomas Jenkins would serve aboard Iowa until the end of the war, overseeing the feeding of her crew through numerous campaigns, including the battles of Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. Under his leadership, the battleship gained a fleet-wide reputation for exceptional food service, even under the most demanding combat conditions. After the war, Jenkins remained in the Navy, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant commander before retiring in 1962. His official legacy in naval records remained modest, a series of commendations for exceptional service and efficiency ratings that consistently exceeded standards. The true impact of his innovations during that crucial week in July 1944 would not be officially recognized until 1983, when the Navy's Food Service Management Program incorporated many of his techniques into standard training. By then, the Iowa method had evolved into established doctrine, its origins largely forgotten by all but a few naval historians. In 1989, during the recommissioning ceremony for USS Iowa, following her extensive modernization, an elderly Thomas Jenkins was invited as an honored guest. As he toured his old domain, the galleys now equipped with technology he could scarcely have imagined in 1944, a young culinary specialist asked if it was true that he had once fed the entire crew for a week with only 3 days' worth of provisions. Jenkins smiled. "Oh, young man," he replied, "when you grow up on a farm during the Depression, you learn that there's always enough food if you know how to use it properly." The lessons of the farm boy from Iowa, who defied Navy regulations to keep his ship combat ready, live on in naval food service to this day. Modern sailors seldom realize that many of the food preparation and conservation techniques now considered standard were born from the desperate innovation of a chief petty officer facing impossible odds in the vast Pacific during the summer of 1944. Throughout naval history, great battles have been won by technological advances, tactical brilliance, and raw courage. But as Thomas Jenkins proved aboard USS Iowa, sometimes victory depends on something as fundamental as having enough to eat. His quiet revolution in naval food service, stretching critical supplies while maintaining the health and fighting spirit of Iowa's crew, represents a different kind of heroism. The commitment to sustain the men who man the guns, regardless of obstacles or regulations. In his final interview before his death in 1997, Jenkins was asked what he considered his greatest contribution to the war effort. His answer was characteristically modest. "I just fed the boys who did the fighting, that's all." But the impact of his innovations reached far beyond Iowa's mess decks. By maintaining the battleship's combat effectiveness during critical operations, Jenkins's culinary creativity contributed directly to American naval dominance in the Pacific. Each meal, served from his improvised methods, provided the energy that powered gun crews, damage control teams, and bridge officers through the decisive battles that ultimately secured victory. The story of Thomas Jenkins and his culinary crew reminds us that wartime heroism takes many forms. While history books celebrate the admirals who planned the strategies and the captains who executed daring maneuvers, the everyday sustenance of fighting forces often goes unmentioned. Yet without the innovation and determination of men like Jenkins, the mightiest battleship would be merely a hollow shell of steel, its potential unrealized. Perhaps most remarkable about Jenkins's achievement is how he transformed a potential crisis into an opportunity for innovation. When faced with regulations that would have compromised Iowa's fighting capability, he drew on knowledge from outside the naval establishment, humble farming practices passed down through generations of heartland families, to solve a problem the Navy's own systems couldn't address. In doing so, he demonstrated a truth that resonates beyond military applications. Sometimes the most effective solutions come not from official doctrine, but from practical experience and the willingness to challenge established methods when circumstances demand it. Today's Navy sailors eat better and more consistently than their World War II predecessors could have imagined. Advanced preservation techniques, global supply chains, and modern nutritional science ensure that America's fighting ships remain well-provisioned even on extended deployments. Yet the fundamental challenge remains the same: maintaining the health, energy, and morale of sailors far from home, often under extremely demanding conditions. The innovative spirit that Thomas Jenkins brought to Iowa's galleys, the determination to feed his sailors properly, regardless of obstacles, continues to inspire naval culinary specialists around the world. Would you have broken established protocols to keep your ship combat-ready? Would you have risked your career on unproven methods when conventional wisdom offered a safer path? These are the questions Jenkins's story poses to us across the decades. As modern navies face new challenges in a changing world, the lesson of USS Iowa's galley crisis remains relevant. Sometimes the greatest contributions to victory come not from following the rulebook, but from having the courage to set it aside when circumstances demand innovative solutions. Thomas Jenkins never called himself a hero. He was simply a farm boy from Iowa who understood the fundamental truth that armies and navies march on their stomachs. In honoring his legacy, we recognize not just one man's contribution to naval history, but the countless unsung heroes who sustain fighting forces through their daily, often overlooked efforts. Share this story of quiet heroism so others will remember that victory sometimes depends not on the thunder of guns, but on the dedication of those who feed the gunners.